The title of this lecture is Survival on Parole in Hawaii, Part 2. We're going to continue looking at the study that we looked at in the previous lecture. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, I want you to print out and use the source. It's the whole report that you get on the internet. There's the website and the name of the report. You should have done that already. But if you haven't, you certainly want to print it out, read it, and use it for this as a resource for these lectures and indeed on the exams. In this part, we're going to look at the general description of success and failure of parolees in Hawaii. Next slide. Oh, one more thing. I just want to apologize. I'm feeling a little bit ill, so I might be coughing and sniffling, and I need to, and these online lectures are kind of weird. You have to just talk continuously into a computer, and you can't really pause like you can in person, so my mouth dries out, and I need to take a sip of water every once in a while, so you may hear that. I want to just apologize for that. I'm not trying to be rude. Okay, I want you to again recall the difference between parole and probation. This is a lecture about parole. Probation, just real crudely, probation means you're convicted of a crime but you never get locked up. You're allowed to be out in the community under a set of restrictive conditions, basically follow the rules, and we won't lock you up. Probation, on the other hand, is early release. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. Parole is early release from prison. Probation, you never go to prison. So when you're placed out on parole, what happens is you get released early from prison. You've been a good little boy or girl in prison and you follow the rules, and they say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to let you out early now under these set of conditions, and if you follow the rules, you never have to go back again. Now, if you don't follow the rules, we may send you back to prison, and you have to do more time. The goal of this lecture is to generally describe the rate of success and failure on parole. So for the purpose of this lecture, people are successful. They're the ones who don't get sent back to prison, if you will, and those who fail, they mess up in some way while they're out on parole, and they go back to prison. The source is 1999 again, but as I said, this is the most up-to-date study on Hawaii parolees, and that's at least publicly available as of this lecture. And so it's good to look at Hawaii as a unique kind of a place. The next two versions of this lecture will look at some of the study results in a bit greater detail. So basically all we're going to try to do in this lecture is see, like we let these people out on parole, and there's how many of them do well and how many of them get sent back to prison. Okay, again, very quickly, why should we even care about parole? In the previous lecture, I went through this in greater detail, but just a quick review. Why should we even bother with parole? Why should we let felons out of prison early in the first place? Why not just lock them up and throw away the key? Let them rot in prison for their entire sentence. Then let them out on the street. What about this truth in sentencing and all that? If it says you're going to get 10 years, you should just do 10 years, and then after 10 years you get out, and that's that. And just letting people out. Early stuff. Now, these are good questions. The basic argument that is behind parole in the first place, and that I sort of agree with in certain instances, you don't let everybody out on parole, but if you decide, you try to make an educated guess on who you let out on parole, it can save the taxpayers a tremendous amount of money and also protect public safety. So, again, here's a look at the yearly costs, and they're staggering. Okay, just in 2006 dollars. According to the Associated Press, it was quoted in the Hawaii Star Bulletin, we have about 1,300 inmates in Hawaii. We have so many inmates that we have to send about half out of state, and we do that because it's cheaper. Those daily costs, as you can see, are about half the cost we have in Hawaii. And we would have to build a new prison, and when you include building costs in a prison, it becomes even more and more expensive. Just think about how much it costs to build a house. Well, a prison is something that really resourceful people can't get out of. It's incredibly expensive to build. Okay, so even though we send about half of our prisoners out of state, look that we're spending $116 million a year. That's a tremendous amount of money. So if we can figure out a way not to, to lower the amount of people that we're locking up, it saves taxpayers money. Furthermore, we want to do it in a way where we minimize risk to the public. We don't want to let people out who are going to go out and victimize people, use their newfound freedom to victimize people. I apologize again, I don't have the per cost estimates of parole, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that it would be much lower to have somebody out on parole, the cost, than putting them in a 24-hour security in a prison. Okay, it's a tremendous savings. Next slide. Okay, here's a general description of survival on parole. Basically, almost half of the people who are granted parole survive or do well. On the other hand, the way to look at it is a little more than half of the people who are let out on parole fail in some manner. Okay, most of those are sent back to prison permanently, about half of them. You can see that 48.2%. A small amount are sent to prison for a small amount of time, that's the 5%. So they're essentially, you messed up, we return you to custody, and then we release you again. So in a way, that's kind of a failure. And then absconded basically means they ran away. So essentially, about 45% of the people follow the rules and survive on parole or do well. Now those 45%, it's 43.9. It depends how you want to look at this return to custody people or not. But a little bit less than half of the people basically follow the rules, survive parole, and do well. They don't fail. So that 45%, if you think about it, is saving the taxpayers a tremendous amount of money. Now the question we want to know is why are these people failing? Are they going out victimizing people or what? And that's what we're going to look at here. So basically, the way I kind of did the math there, you can see below, is that I took the 599 people minus 263. So 336 of the parolees failed in some way, and 263 of them succeeded, depending, again, how you want to look at the other one. Okay, next slide. Okay, why do more than half of people fail? This is a good question. Here's what I want you to think about. And I might want you to actually push pause at the end of this slide here. Is it because they went out and convicted a new crime, i.e. they took advantage of their freedom? Isn't that sort of the popular image of when you think, okay, a person failed on parole? Well, what they did is they were let out early and they went back to crime. So how many of these people who fail, remember, more than half fail, okay, how many of them, what percentage of them fail because they did go out and commit a new crime? So stop for a second. What do you think? Push pause, okay, and then write down a number. So I want you to think, what percentage of the people who fail went out and committed a new crime? So the reason that they failed on parole is because they went out and they took advantage of their parole to commit a new crime. Okay, so I would like you to push pause and write down a number and then go to the next slide. Okay, so write down a number. Just what do you think? What percentage of the people who fail because they commit a new crime? And then go to the next slide. Okay, so as you can see by this table, I was actually quite surprised. This data shows that only about 30% commit any crime whatsoever. What that means is that 70%, over 7 in 10, 71% actually, commit no crimes whatsoever while they're out on parole. So, that was pretty amazing. So one way to look at that is that 70% of parolees are not taking advantage of their newfound freedom, if you will, to go out and commit a new crime of any type. And as you'll see below, most who fail do so for what they call technical reasons, i.e. not following the rules that the Hawaii Paroling Authority in their PO set. So according to the author on page 23 of the report, here's a quote: "These data are illustrative of the finding that the majority of returns to prison were not for newly acquired felony or misdemeanor convictions, but because of the HPA determining that the parolee had failed to comply with the rules of his or her parole." Okay. Put it another way, also on page 23, 7 out of 10 parolees had no convictions after their release. 17.9% had one or more convictions on non-felony charges. That would be a misdemeanor, petty misdemeanor, or an ordinance. And 5.7% had one or more felony convictions only, and then another 5% had convictions on both felony and misdemeanors. So in plain English, what this means is that about 12% had at least one or more new felony charges, okay, while they were out in prison. What's important about a felony is all these people, you can only get sent to prison for over a year for a felony. So a misdemeanor, you don't, unless you've got an extensive record, you generally don't, you may do some jail time, but you're not going to do prison time. So in our society, what we say is that felonies are the most serious types of crimes, and you're going to do time in prison for a felony. A felony record will follow you where you go, etc. You have to mark it on a job application, etc. And about 18% of these people had just misdemeanors. So they wouldn't be sent to prison for this type of charge, but they were committing crimes. Okay, so let's review. Although all crimes are bad, if you will, only a felony can send you to prison and make you eligible for parole in the first place. So everyone in this study committed a felony that sent them to prison in the first place. And all of them were let out of prison early on parole because they were good boys and girls in prison. So, of the 599 people who were let out of prison early, only 68% of them, that's about 12%, used their newfound freedom to commit another felony crime. Okay. Now, I would never have guessed that 70% of people didn't commit a new crime, let alone only 12% about committing a felony crime. I would have thought it would have been much higher. My sort of image of these parolees is they get out and they're out victimizing the public, if you will. Now, let me give you two caveats so we can be, a caveat is sort of like, let's not go crazy here. Let me just put this as a foundation. An additional 507 people, that's about the 18% you see there, committed a misdemeanor. Now, a person doesn't get sent to prison on an original misdemeanor conviction, but just because it's not a felony doesn't mean it's a good crime or something. Okay? So I want to be clear about that. I mean, a misdemeanor can hurt people too. We'll look at actually what types of crimes they do commit later, and I think you'll be surprised as I was. But just because it's not a felony doesn't mean it's not bad. But in our society, only felonies send you to prison. Another caveat, number 2, is that these are just convictions. So that means that these figures only count the people who were caught. Okay, but that's the way our system works. Okay, you're only convicted if you're caught. So not me, not you, or nor anybody else has any idea how many parolees did or did not commit additional crimes. This is the only data we have. You can't make up a number, okay? You can't slip into what I call soundbite mentality and think, oh, all of them committed crimes. They just didn't get caught. I mean, you can slip into that kind of thinking, but you would not be a good critical thinker. And you might want to abandon college and start watching daytime TV or something for your quote-unquote education. Because this is real data. Us going, oh, that's philosophizing. Okay, and no one knows the real answer. And I want to base my bias is that I think we should base public policy on real data as opposed to just what people think in their head. So in general, a very low percentage of them go back to crime. Use their newfound freedom of parole to go back to crime. About 20 of it is what we call serious crime, a felony, about 12%, and about 18% of it is less serious. So that's about 30% are committing some crime whatsoever. Okay, now let's go to the next slide and ask another. So if only 12% people commit new felonies, or if you want to say if 30% commit a crime, why do 55% of them fail? The reason why I say 12% of them is because, remember, only a felony is something that can send you to prison originally. So if you do a misdemeanor and you weren't on parole, you wouldn't be sent to prison. So if only 12% or commit new felonies, how come 55% of them fail? Or if you like to do the 30%, using misdemeanors and felonies, say, well, if 30% of them commit new crimes, how come 55% of them fail? Basically, the answer, as I mentioned earlier, is because they're not following the technical rules of parole. I want you to note that these percentages don't add up to 100 because these are just most of the common rule violations cited for revocation of parole. When I revoke it, I don't revoke your parole, but when you get your parole revoked, that means you failed on parole and we're going to send you back to prison. Okay, so these are the most common rule violations cited. So remember, 70% of people are not committing any new crimes, but 55% of the group is failing. Okay. So, if only 35% of people, if only about 30% go back to crime, 12% felonies, why are 55% of them failing on parole? In short, they're not following the rules of parole. Okay, they were let out early under a set of conditions called the terms of parole, and they could not follow these conditions that they agreed to. Okay, the details are on page 23 and 20 report, but 23 and page 24 of the report. But essentially, these rule violations appear to be primarily related to, and I quote, parolee behavior related to possession of drugs and the failure to maintain contact with the parole officer. That's on the end of page 23 and beginning of page 24. So these are the most common technical violations for failing parole, if you will. So what these data indicate is that the majority of parole failures are not because parolees commit new crimes, whether felony or not, okay, while out on the streets, but because they don't follow the conditions of parole. In other words, they don't follow the rules that they agreed to follow as a condition of their early release from prison. Okay, so these data seem to indicate that drug use, dirty urine, is the primary reason for them failing. One could also argue that this failure to make contact with the PO, some of that could be related to, I know I'm dirty, I'll test dirty because I know when I go in. That could be related to drug use. We don't know how much of it, but it's sort of logical to assume that some unknown percentage of that 25%, some number of those people, didn't go maintain their contact with the parole officer because, think about it, I know when I go to my parole officer, he or she is going to give me a P test, and I know I'm going to show up dirty. So what am I going to do? Avoid the contact with parole. So that could be one of the reasons why. I mean, that could be related, okay, to drug use. Just to give you an explanation of these rule violations, a dirty urine test is called a violation of Rule 1D. You don't need to know the 1D part, but basically, interestingly, it's having drugs in your urine. Interestingly, I talked to one of the research assistants who worked on the report, and having drugs in your urine is not a violation of the law unless you're driving. But it is a violation of the conditions of parole. So when you agree to get on parole, you agree that you won't take drugs and that we're going to test you for drugs, etc. The next most common rule cited was failure to maintain the regular scheduled contacts with parole in 25% of the cases. So remember, that's one of the rules of parole too, is that you're going to maintain regular contacts with your parole. I think when you start out, you go visit the parole officer twice a month, and then the parole officer has 2 forms of alternative contact. So basically, they're not following those rules. Neither one of these should be a big surprise to you because remember, approximately 90% of the parolees were deemed as having some life disruption from drug use. 70% were rated as having serious life disruption for drug use. So it should not become a big surprise to you that the majority of parole failures appear to be related to their drug problems. But if 90% of the people in prison, this is just those who were let out early on parole, have drug problems, and they were able to use drugs while in prison, assuming they could afford them in prison, then when we let them out of prison, what do you think is going to happen? Okay, so think about this. 90% of the people who are let out on parole are rated as having at least some drug problem. 70% are rated as having a serious life disruption from their drugs. The dirty little secret is you can get any drug you want in prison. Okay, you're not going to get any official to admit it or say it, but talk to anybody who's been to prison, and they will tell you you can get any drug if you got the money in prison. Okay, so it's no big wonder if we send them in a cage for using drugs, and you have a drug problem, and you can use drugs while you're in that cage. Then when we let you out of that cage, that we have people who have problems using drugs. Okay, that to me is not like duh. That to me is not that to me is not surprising data. Okay, I personally, if I were locked up, would be mighty tempted to get intoxicated while living in a cage with a bunch of social idiots if I was staring at about 4 years behind bars with those freaks. So remember, these people on this study served about 4 years. Again, personally, to me, this is just my personal bias. The notion of locking people up, a drug user up with a whole bunch of weirdos and freakazoids who are very violent, is somehow going to motivate them to become a better person is sort of crazy if you think about it. If this somehow locking me up in a cage is going to motivate me to quit using drugs when I could use drugs in that cage, it's kind of a crazy, doesn't make sense to me. So this is just sort of my rant against sending nonviolent drug users to prison in the first place. So you can ignore that if you want. But these data sort of indicate, see, there's the problem. It's drug use, drug use, drug use. And so we have this notion that if we're going to lock people up, it's going to teach them not to use drugs. Well, the insanity of it is you can get any drug you want in prison, and then we let you out anyway. And then, look, you fail on parole. Why? Because you have dirty urine. So it's sending people to prison for using drugs is quite a crazy proposition. Now, stealing something or hurting somebody is a different issue, and I don't have a problem with sending people to prison for that. But we're going to sort of look at this question of what are these people doing and why are they failing on parole in greater numbers and greater detail in the following lectures. But these are the most common. Remember, most people who fail due to technical reasons, not because they commit a new crime. And these are the most common reasons, and it appears that it's primarily related to their drug use. Okay, what's the conclusion? Is the glass half empty or half full here? Remember, about half the people succeed, a little less than half, and a little more than half fail. Depends on you look at it, but it's pretty close to half-half. So is the glass half empty or half full? Okay, it depends how you look at it. Okay, but what I want you to do is to be a critical thinker. So first, when you evaluate any public policy, especially one seeks to solve a crime problem, you should not expect a 100% success rate. Okay, politicians like to say things like, one person failing on parole is one person too many. One person who commits a crime when we let them out of prison early is one too many. They like to say these things because it makes a good soundbite. Okay, it sounds good on the evening news where you get 8 seconds to present your position. But when you go beyond soundbite intellectual shallowness that seems to dominate more and more of our public discourse, you kind of realize that such statements are asinine. Okay? That's right. Such statements are ignorant. Upon just a tiny little bit of reflection, you can see that those statements are stupid, dumb, etc., and they hurt our state, our country, indeed our whole world. Okay, it may make for great politics to say something like that, but it makes for horrendous public policy. Okay, you can never expect to have a 100% success rate in any social problem, especially, excuse me for saying that's my eubonics from growing up, especially when we're talking about criminals. These people are by definition socially disorganized. So the goal of crime policy is to improve, is to make things better. So my bias towards public policy is this, is I care about saving the taxpayers money. I want a cost-effective public policy, not a feel-good soundbite policy that may sound good on the evening news, but it ends up costing us more money in the long run. So that's my bias, if you want to call it that. I think cost-effective public policy seems like common sense to me and not bias, because there's only so much public money that we have to spend, and we should spend that wisely. But if you want to call that a bias, that's fine. But I'm interested in saving taxpayers money. I'm also interested, as you'll see, in protecting the public as well, and it appears that we are doing that, generally speaking, when you look more and more into this report. Okay, so now we know that about 55% fail, and about 45% succeed when they're let out of prison early. We also know that over 7 in 10 of the failures, are not due to being convicted of a new crime whatsoever. Most are due to technical violations, meaning they didn't follow the rules and conditions of parole. Okay, so basically they didn't keep their word. Or more precisely, they could talk the talk to the parole board, but they couldn't walk the walk once they got out. Okay, so now before we panic and complain about how bad or unsuccessful the Hawaii parole system is, remember, almost half, 44%, that's more than 4 in 10, were successful. And this saved the Hawaii taxpayers a whole lot of money. Remember, every day a person is locked up costs Hawaii taxpayers at least $56 a day and up to $110 per day. Okay, again, I apologize that I couldn't find the per day cost figures for parole, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the cost of parole must be much, much cheaper than a 24-hour secure facility that provides 3 meals, health care, power, free laundry, free cleaning supplies, toothpaste, drugs, medical care, etc. It doesn't take a rocket scientist. Remember, we're spending about $110 million per year locking people up. Now, furthermore, and most importantly, these data show that about 70% of those people fail. Who fail? Remember, 45% succeed now, but those 70% of those who fail, of everybody, 70% are not out on the street committing new crimes. Okay, they're not using their freedom as a chance to go back to victimizing the public whatsoever. So as a group, these failures are not due to new predatory behavior, if you will, just sort of social disorganization. Don't get me wrong, some people are predators and we should be locked up behind bars. Don't get me wrong there. Okay. The critical question for public policy, though, is what percentage of these people are actually using that newfound freedom of parole to become vicious predators and need to be locked up in a cage. Okay, so we know that 70% of them are committing no crimes, but what about, and we know that, okay, most of these are due to technical violations, but we also know that about 30% of them are committing crimes or convicted of crimes, 12% which are felonies. Now, I want to know what percentage of those crimes are actually predatory, dangerous behavior that's a danger to the public and me and my children. Okay, so in the next lecture, we're actually going to look at that. What you're going to, just to stay tuned, what you're going to see is that most failures on parole are not predatory behavior, if you will, just social disorganization. And the next lecture is going to look at that. So stay tuned and we'll find out more about how and why these people can't organize these lives. But just to me, the glass is, it is half empty and it's half full. In general, the public is being protected, as you'll see when we look at the type of crimes, and we're saving a whole lot of money. However, to be fair and balanced, in the next lecture, we're going to look at those 30% of people, those parolees who commit new crimes are out on parole. So the question for the next lecture is going to be, if 30% of parolees go back to crime and virtually all those who committed a new felony are sent back to prison, the important policy question is, what sorts of new crimes do these 30% of parolees who went back to crime commit? Are they violent predators? That's what popular opinion seems to suggest. Or are they just, what kinds of crimes are they committing? Are they crimes that you and me as people of the public would be concerned about? We say, no, we'd rather not have them let out in the first place. So the next lecture, we're going to look at that type of question. So that's the end of this lecture.